Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for our morning lecture. Despite the cold weather outside, maybe it is freezing, but today it looks like a little better than the other day. But I'm sure you won't regret your early trip here, because a very interesting speech by Dr. Seong-won Son is waiting for you. He's going to give us a talk today on a very hot subject, namely the current state of the world economy and its investment implications for individuals as well as for business community. As you know, the global economy is at a crossroad at the moment. I think it is likely to get worse before it will get better. The U.S. economy is showing no sign of any quick recovery, while the sovereign debt crisis in Europe is most likely to be spreading beyond Europe, threatening the global business community, of course, including Korea. And this situation is very difficult situation. The most critically important part of the problem is that we still don't know about what kind of policy actions will be taken by the U.S., especially by European leaders. What policy actions will be taken by European leaders today and in a couple of months, I think, the very survival of the Eurozone or the survival of European Union itself may be at stake. That's why we have invited Dr. Seong-won Son over here today, hoping that he will provide some clues on these very difficult issues. I believe he is one of the prime candidates who could deliver or who can address these difficult issues, because I know that he worked with the Wells Fargo Bank as chief economist for more than 2 decades. And he was very successful there. And he's now chair professor of economics at the California State University. And before he took up the position, he also worked with the Hanmi Financial Group as president. So he is well qualified and most well experienced in this area. And he also had a good education. He had an MBA from Harvard University and a doctoral degree in economics from University of Pittsburgh. What a good combination for becoming a good economic analyst. Well, he's today with us, and I'm grateful to him. And ladies and gentlemen, why don't you join me in welcoming him?
Right now I'm going to make my presentation in English, but at the end, if you want to ask me questions in Korean, that is fine as well. Let me go around the world in about half an hour. United States, Europe, China, and even Korea. And then at the end, I do want to spend some time about investment implications. Where do you put your money in? And these are some of the issues that I'm going to talk about. Well, we all know that the U.S. economy has not been doing all that well. As Chairman Nam pointed out, the U.S. economy is showing no sign of a quick recovery, but in a minute I want to tell you that it's not getting any worse either. One of the reasons why we are all concerned about the U.S. economy is the employment situation. There aren't too many jobs. and employers are not hiring people. But the good news is that the layoffs have slowed down. This is going to be a long-term phenomenon. We're not going to see, as Chairman Nam pointed out, a quick recovery in the U.S. unemployment job situation anytime soon. If you look at various economic recoveries, you see 1981, 1990, 74, and et cetera, and then at the bottom, the black one, that is the current economic recovery. We are still below where we were at the beginning of the economic recovery, or the beginning of the previous peak. And so that means it's going to take a while for us to get back to where we were to the pre-recession peak in 2007. At best, we are talking about slow, gradual, sluggish economic recovery. If you look at the labor participation rate in the United States, we see a very interesting phenomenon. In red, you see these are the ages, 65-year-olds, 55-year-olds, 25-year-olds, and etc. Typically, what happens is that as year goes on from the economic recession, older people, they drop out of the labor force, and younger people, they join the labor force. We are seeing the opposite phenomenon. The people who are 55 and older, 65 and older, they are not dropping out of the labor force. In fact, they are staying because they have to. That means there aren't any opportunities. There are fewer positions open for younger folks. And so we are seeing jobless rate for the teenagers, for example, and the people in their 20s actually going up, not going down. So this is somewhat of a peculiar phenomenon in America. We have not seen this during the post-World War period. If you look at the number of illegal aliens coming across from Mexico to the United States, actually it is going down and down and down. If anything, the Mexicans are going back home because there are more jobs in Mexico than there are in the United States. See, and so people say that now the Mexican government may decide to put up a wall to prevent their own country folks from coming back to Mexico because they have their own problems. If you look at the real median income, that is income adjusted for inflation, as you can see, it is now back to where it was in about 1998. So real median income is going down. And this is one of the reasons why many companies in America, they are changing their advertising strategy. Here is a company called Procter & Gamble. Those of you who know some of the American products, you know, these are very typical American products people buy. The Tide, the Bounty, Dawn, and Shaman, Ultrite, etc. But these are relatively more expensive brand items. But these items are not selling. Therefore, the same company, Procter & Gamble, they are trying to push, advertise, and sell cheaper brands like Cheers rather than Tide, basic Charmin, and then basic Bounties, and etc. Why? Because this is what people are buying. So today, people are counting pennies. But I also want to point out that even though things are not going all that well in the United States, I'm reasonably sure that it's not going to get any worse. It will actually get better. Not a whole lot, very slowly, gradually, as I pointed out, but it is getting better. Now, why do I have this sort of an optimism? If you look at the number of jobs, as I pointed out, we're not creating a whole lot of jobs, but we are creating jobs. And if you look at the monthly change in employment jobs compared to previous month or previous year, you can see we are seeing more and more jobs. In the United States, we need to create about 150,000 jobs a month in order to keep the jobless rate about the same, stable. Today, we're not doing that. But hopefully, toward the end of 2012, we will see more job creation, which means that hopefully the jobless rate will drop, but again, very slowly. The other good news in America is cars. Of course, during the financial crisis and because of the Japanese tsunami, car production and car sales were hurt significantly. But that is now behind us. As you can see, if you look at auto production in America from Detroit, that is also going up. They are producing more. Why? Because they are selling more cars. Today, some of the best-selling cars in America, those are Detroit-made and then Korean-made, not the Japanese. I remember, for example, one of the luxury brands, Lexus, made by Toyota. That used to be one of the hottest-selling cars in America. Today, no one is buying Lexus, see? And no one is, well, I wouldn't say no one, but there are very few people buying Toyotas. Instead, people are buying, again, as I pointed out, well, Hyundai and Kia and so Korean cars. The Korean cars are doing very well. Anyway, when it comes to cars, Americans are willing to spend money to buy cars. And here you see the retail sales. Here we are around the holiday shopping season. And for retailers in America, about 40% of all the annual sales come from the holiday shopping season. And if you look at the retail sales, excluding automobiles, as you can see, it is not zooming up, but still it is going in the right direction. So we are cautiously optimistic that we will see a modest increase in holiday shopping sales in 2011. Last year, as you recall, it actually went down. And then so we don't want that, but this year it's going to look a little bit better. A main problem in the American economy, of course, is housing. In the United States, 1 out of 8 jobs depends on housing. That's right, 1 out of 8 jobs by the time you include not only construction but also finance, like mortgages, for example. And so housing has been in a difficult position for quite some time. But again, here too, we are beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel. That is not to say that it is going to turn around significantly better. That is not the case. But if you see, look at this chart. This is the ratio of a median price of a single-family homes to annual household income. Right now, it is in pretty good shape. Whereas if you look at 2006, 2007, it was way up high, and in hindsight, it was obvious that we were in a bubble, and the bubble was going to about to burst. But at the time, no one believed it. But the bubble did burst, and right now, house prices are so low, interest rates are so low, affordability, that is one of the positives that we see in American housing. So house prices have gone down so low. The housing is at the bottom, so it is really difficult to go down any lower. And that's the situation. And again, as I pointed out, housing is very important because, again, 1 out of 8 jobs in the country depends on housing. If you look at house prices, this is so-called the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index. And if you look at the blue line and the red line is, of course, the monthly change, and the blue line is the year-over-year percent change. And then, as you can see, it is not back to where it should be, but it's beginning to stabilize. In 2011, and then possibly during the first half of 2012, we might still see some declines in housing compared to a year ago. But my hope and expectation is that it is beginning to stabilize, and then again, you've got to stabilize first before you can go up. And then so we are taking the first step. The other positive news is, as you can see, the foreclosures and delinquencies and foreclosures. To be sure, there are a lot of homes to be foreclosed. Banks, for example, American banks, they are afraid of foreclosing too many houses for political reasons. And they've gotten a lot of flack and then blames for foreclosing too many homes. And so there will be more foreclosures coming up in the future. But if you look at the overall trend, you can see it did peak about a year ago, and it is beginning to trend down a little bit. And then so to me, this is a good sign that maybe the worst is behind us. Going back to housing affordability, as I pointed out, house prices are down, interest rates are so low. It is a good time to buy a house if you can buy a house and if you need a house. Another way of looking at that is you look at the mortgage payment, monthly payments if you bought a house versus median rent if you rent a house. Clearly in 2006 and 2007 it was way out of whack. But right now the prices are about the same. If you rent the house, that is roughly equal to what you would pay buying a house. And then so assuming that house prices will hopefully improve in the next 10 years, and I'm sure it will, you might actually be better off buying a house rather than renting one. The other, I guess I'm trying to find some good news in the American economy, even though, again, no one is talking about the major economic upturn. fiscal drag. When you combine the federal, state, and local governments, as you can see, its impact on the economy has and will continue to be negative. And clearly, the federal government, in a minute I'm going to talk about, will have to cut back spending. And the good news, though, is that if you look at the state and local governments, actually now the states are in a much better financial shape, the blue line, whereas the local governments, whose revenues depend on property taxes, they are still continuing to suffer. But the state governments, they get a lot of the revenues from sales taxes and income taxes. And sales and income taxes are going up, and therefore the financial situation is gradually improving. Again, they are still in a difficult financial strait, to be sure, but again, it is getting better. And so that's another ray of hope in the economy. Chairman Bernanke, clearly he has done a lot, and the question is, what more will he do in the future? Well, there will be an FOMC meeting fairly shortly, and then everyone is expecting to see what he can and cannot do. We all know, if you look at the so-called federal funds rate, if you look at the red line, that's what the federal funds rate is, at 0 right now. But if you use so-called Taylor's formula, as you know, Professor Taylor at Stanford University, he devised a small, simple formula called the Taylor's rule, and that kind of tells you mathematically, theoretically, where the federal funds rate should be. And if you look at the blue line, that's what that is. And then the mathematical formula says it should be negative, as a matter of fact, minus 4%. And so in this case, we should pay you to borrow money rather than you paying the interest rate. Well, clearly the interest rate cannot be negative in the United States. Therefore, the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates at 0, Chairman Bernanke said, until mid-2013. And I wouldn't be surprised if it goes well beyond that. But also he's engaged in so-called the Operation Twist. On the left-hand side, you see the red bars, the maturities in 1 year or less, and 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, and then the 10 years. So that's what you see on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see the average maturity. Chairman Bernanke and his colleagues are trying to extend the average maturity of the outstanding U.S. Treasuries. And the idea is to reduce the long-term interest rates. By reducing the long-term interest rates, he's hoping that this will reduce the mortgage rate, even though they are already very low. He's hoping that borrowing rates for capital spending for businesses to buy equipment, to build plants will be lower. Now, I think it is hard to tell right now whether we've had any significant, meaningful impact from so-called the Operation Twist, essentially lowering the long-term interest rates by buying longer-term treasuries. But nevertheless, Chairman Bernanke is doing what he can. I mean, we all know there's a lot of liquidity. You look at the amount of liquidity, over $3 trillion. And there's a saying in English, you can lead the horse to water, but you cannot make the horse to drink. And that's pretty much the situation. We are flooded in liquidity. There is so much liquidity. As a matter of fact, American banking system has over $1 trillion deposited at the Federal Reserve. And I happen to be, vice chairman of a company in America, and our company has a lot of cash. And some of the banks actually, they are saying that we do not want your deposits. We have so much liquidity. If you want to deposit $10 million, we'll pay you half of 1%. If you want to deposit $20 million rather than high interest rates, they say, well, then we are going to cut the interest rates from 0.5% to 0.25%. If you want to deposit $30 million, we're going to pay you nothing. So they do not want your money, so that they are providing perverse incentives for the business to deposit. Why? Because they've got so much liquidity. Anyway, in America today, the problem is not the level of interest rates. The problem is not the amount of liquidity. And so the dilemma Chairman Bernanke is really facing is, how do I get the people to spend money? And then so no one really has the answer. He doesn't, I don't. And then so that's kind of a dilemma. Now, one thought that people have talked about, I don't think he's going to do this anytime soon, but eventually, if the economy continues to worsen, he may have to follow the Japanese path and maybe start quantitative easing 3 And most likely in this case, he will probably buy mortgage-backed securities. And again, the purpose is to lower the mortgage rate. Today in America, if you want to take out a mortgage, buy a house, and get a mortgage, you could probably borrow it for 4.15%. And his hope is that maybe he could lower it to 4%, maybe 3.5%, maybe to 3%, and then more people would be willing to buy. And one concern that we have in America right now is even though there's a lot of liquidity, banks are awfully cautious. They're not lending money, see? And then so they've been burned so badly. Credit quality, that is a primary consideration. They're not interested in earning money at the moment. They are more interested in maintaining their capital and making sure that their asset quality is under control. So again, the question is, even though Chairman Bernanke could lower the interest rates again, but will it do any good? And so far, I guess the question is mixed. One area that we can do something about is, of course, the federal budget deficits. And as Chairman Nam pointed out, this is one big area of uncertainty. And this is someplace that, we can do a lot of good. But politicians in Washington, they cannot agree on anything. In fact, if you look at a survey, you ask people, which direction is America going? And the answer is decidedly no confidence. That is, U.S. moving is in the wrong direction. The U.S. is moving in the wrong direction. Why? Primarily because there is a real problem with budget deficits. Not only the size today, but also the future direction is uncertain. People are saying, well, the deficits will go up and up and up, and that's bad for the economy. And I know that sooner or later, I will have to pay higher tax rates to pay for the deficits. Therefore, I do not want to spend the money. I do not want to hire people. I want to be safe and cautious and careful. That's what people are saying. We all know how large the deficits are. And I suppose, one good news about the American deficit is that we have the printing press. I know China worries about whether America can pay them back. Well, that is a misplaced concern. All the U.S. debts are in U.S. dollars, so that, we can print the money, the dollar, and then pay anybody off, so that there's no chance that United States will renege. In fact, when S&P lowered the U.S. country rating from AAA to AA, I think they made a mistake. Again, the key difference is that, South Korea cannot print the dollars, but the United States can print the dollars, so that there's no chance that the United States will renege on its foreign loan commitments. But anyway, be that as it may, you can see the deficits are pretty high. Well, Republicans clearly they want to cut spendings, and if you look at the U.S. budget situation, Social Security, that's about 22%, Medicaid, that's about 8%. The interest obligation, that's about 14%. Medicare, 17%. Defense, about 15%. And when you add them up, this is about 65%. And then so you really have to try to balance the budget based on other spending, which is 23%. That is not possible, see? And so, politicians, they talk about, especially Republicans, they talk about cutting spendings, but, well, the devil is in the detail. And how do you do that? And one area that clearly we have to address is healthcare spending. America is getting older, getting grayer, and all of us are, including myself. Therefore, it is costing a lot more money in healthcare spending. And you can see the projection is that if we do not do anything, it will be going up very rapidly. So we've got to do something about it, control it, but the politicians, they have not been able to come up with a program. Democrats, on the other hand, they want to increase taxes on the rich. The problem is that our deficits are so large. There are a lot of people who are rich, but there aren't enough of them to make any difference. You can raise taxes on the rich. It makes a good political headlines, but will it generate enough revenues to make any kind of a dent on budget deficits? The answer to that is no. And so again, you can see we are talking about really the rhetorics and not getting down to the real issue. But, kind of summarizing about the U.S. economy, though, U.S. economy actually is going to improve slightly in 2012 from 2011. In 2011, it will grow less than 2%, more like 1.5%. But in 2012, we are hoping that it will be growing close to maybe 2.5%. Clearly, this is insufficient, not adequate. But again, we've hit the bottom, and then we are going to be experiencing very sluggish recovery. That's why I say this is a stagnation, not an economic recovery. And even compared to previous economic stagnation that we have experienced, it is going to be pretty slow, sluggish, and gradual. So nothing to write home about, nothing to celebrate, nothing to get excited about. While the United States is not all that exciting, we all know, as Chairman Nam pointed out, we've got a real problem in Europe. The survival of the euro is at stake. Now, one might say, why should I care? You know, let them suffer. There are two reasons why you and I, in the United States and Korea, we should worry about what's happening in Europe. Number one, the global financial markets are linked together like a spider web. When Europe shakes, we shake in the financial markets. We all know what's been happening to stock prices in Korea, in the United States. The second reason is, of course, exports. For China, the biggest export market for China is Europe. The biggest market for the United States, in dollars and cents, that's Europe. Korea is exporting quite a bit to Europe as well. And so that when Europe cannot buy from Korea, from China, from the United States, our exports are going to suffer. So those are some of the concerns. Europe right now has the correct, right recipe for recession. They are and they will go into recessions if they are not in it already. They've got credit crunch. They've got, of course, a fiscal restraint, and that will continue. And there's no confidence. So when you have these three items, that is really the perfect mix for an economic recession, and they're not going to be getting out of it very rapidly. If you look at the economic forecast, we are saying that in 2012, in the Eurozone as a whole, we will see actual declines in economic growth and economic recession. Here, there are a lot of numbers, but I don't want to get into all these details. But the point is that European nations have a lot of debt. And if you look at the down below, Eurozone average, the debt, sovereign debt as a percent of GDP, it is 85%. In the United States, it's 94%. But again, as I pointed out, U.S. is in better shape because, again, we've got the dollar printing press, see? And then whereas Ireland, Italy, Austria, and Belgium, and then these countries, they do not have the euro printing press, and those are some of the problems. So the point is that they got a lot of debt, Greece and Italy and Belgium, and etc. Again, there are a lot of numbers, but again, don't worry about these details. But the point I'm trying to make is that in 2008 and 2009, as you recall, we went through so-called the subprime mortgage crisis. And many of the American banks have really cleaned up the subprime mortgage problems. But if you look at the European banks from RBS, HSBC, and Deutsche Bank, and ING, Credit Agricole, etc., they have not cleaned up their problems, so that their asset quality problems related to mortgages are still there. And on top of that, they've got now sovereign debt problems. So you can see the problem is much worse. The other problem that many of these European countries have is their productivity. Economists call unit labor cost, that is cost after adjusting for productivity gains. And if you look at the unit labor cost, you can see Greece and Italy and Spain compared to Germany has been going up and up and up. So how does Greece expect to compete with Germany? How does Italy expect to compete with Germany and Spain and etc.? And so this is one of the problems. They are not competitive, and that's why euro has been very good for Germany, but very bad for Greece, Italy, and Spain. Remember last March, I was in Greece to give a speech, and some of the Greeks were complaining that these German and French and then British banks, they came to us and they sold drugs like opium, and then now these drug dealers are trying to get us to pay, and they said, hell no, we're not going to pay. And then so pretty much that's how what they believe, that is they're not competitive. If you look at the deposits, there's a credit crunch going on. Many of the European banks, they are losing deposits, and that's one of the reasons why they're having to borrow money from their European central banks. So what do you do in case of the European situation? Many people have put pinning a lot of hopes about the possible solution, and then over the last week or so, they did come to some sort of an agreement. And unfortunately, as I see it, they have really not solved any fundamental problems at all. And to me, that is more like a window dressing, and I think the problems will continue. And well, let's look at the steps. First of all, there is and will continue to be austerities, especially on the part of the countries in Southern Europe, Portugal, Greece, Spain, and Italy, and etc. That will continue, and then that means their economies are not going to grow. In fact, they will be in deep recession. That's one. They have talked about, the 23 nations in the European Union, as you know, they have agreed to a fiscal union, but I'm not at all sure that they can really enforce it. Under the Maastricht Treaty, they already have the provision which says that you cannot increase your budget deficit beyond 3% of GDP, and your outstanding debt cannot be more than 60% of GDP, but everyone violated it, including Germany. So, how do you enforce it? And as a matter of fact, even though they did agree to some sort of a new formula enforcement mechanism, but there's a good chance that many of these new rules have to be approved through referendum in some of the countries. And I don't think the people in some of these countries will approve that. So the probability of a fiscal union that they have agreed on by the 23 nations actually becoming a reality is very slim. And even if it did, again, my question is, well, someone violates it, like Germany, they violated again, France and Italy. So what do you do? How do you enforce it? And then so I don't think we have really found a solution. The other thing that we have to do is, of course, restructure loans. As I pointed out, the Greeks were telling me that the German and French and the British banks, these are drug dealers, and they sold drugs, and then now they want to be paid. Well, I mean, you have to understand that, of course, Greece and Italy, they borrow too much. We all know that. But also the banks, the French and German and British banks, they made big mistakes by lending money. And so they should bear the consequences. And they should bear the consequences by writing them off. My calculation would show that in case of like Greece, these banks should write off about 70%. And then if Greece is left with about 30% of the outstanding loans, they might be able to service it, but not under the current situation. So there will have to be a lot more write-offs than what they've agreed to, which means that they are running out of capital. They have no capital. So really the European countries such as Germany and France and the United Kingdom, they will have to support their own banks through taxpayer assistance like the U.S. did in the United States. We call that TARP. What they need is a TARP in Europe. And of course, politicians, especially in France, for example, they are resisting that. Why? Because, of course, this is an election year coming up. And the last thing President Sarkozy wants to talk about is bailing out the banks, which are not very popular in the first place. And so they're trying to push the problem onto someone else, like to the European Central Bank. But the point is that there will have to be significant restructuring, write off many of these sovereign debt. And again, I'm saying that 70 to 80% would have to be written off in case of countries like Greece. Also, I believe the euro should be broken up. Professor Robert Mundell, he won the Nobel Prize by writing an article about working on the so-called on the single currency, and he laid out some of the conditions under which a currency union would work. And in case of a European Union, they have violated almost every one of those conditions. And do you suppose, like in the United States, we have 50 states, right? A single currency. It works. Why? Because we are very similar. The language, the culture, the customs, and the economy, they are very similar. On the other hand, if you put the United States and Guatemala, do you think that would work? If we put the United States and El Salvador and Guatemala, you suppose that currency union would work? Of course it's not going to work. And that's the situation they have in Europe right now. And then so, let me just get back to, let's see, okay. And then so, my thought is that the euro will have to be broken up. And there are two ways of doing that. Number one is, of course, allowing Greece and maybe Spain and Portugal, these countries, to leave. The other possibility is simply Germany to leave the euro, and then maybe even France. And so really the country, the euro needs to be broken up. So I think that's one of the things that needs to be done. My conclusion, again, is that they have gone through some discussions in recent weeks, but they have not addressed the fundamental economic problems. Again, to me, one of the fundamental economic problems is that the euro in the current form cannot survive. If we could somehow get through the current crisis, the problems would occur again, because it is not natural for Guatemala and the United States to be in the same bed together. It is not natural for Greece and Germany to be competing on the same basis. That is not possible. So they need to be broken up. They need to be realistic. Again, as I said, they have to face the music. And European banks, they need to write off as much as 70 to 80% of the loans outstanding to the southern European countries. And again, until and unless they do that, all the things, all the agreements they do, it will be for naught. It's not going to solve any problems. Well then, United States is not doing all that great, even though hopefully things will get slightly better. Europe is on the rocks, so where do we go to invest? Well, I guess one place that we do look to is, of course, Asia. And I'm not telling you anything that you do not know. But this is the kind of a speech I give to my American audiences, and when I go to Europe, like I did in Greece, this is what I even tell them, look to Asia, because that's where the action is. Not to U.S., not to the United States, not to Europe, not to Japan, but look to Asia. You look at the black line that tells you Asia's contribution to global GDP growth. That is about 40%. And chances are it will be going up. Why? Because advanced nations are not growing very much, and Asian nations are growing much more rapidly. And if you look at investments in Asia, I'm not talking about stocks and bonds, but I'm talking about the plant and equipment. You can see the red portion, that is China. The blue portion is Asia excluding China. And you can see really the Asian, the investment accounts for like more than half. So this is what the action is. I tell people that Asia is a place to produce and invest and sell. So young men, go to Asia. And, in the United States, people used to say, well, Asia, China, and Taiwan, and then, not Korea, but the Vietnam, Indonesian, and etc., they just produce cheap goods, and, that used to be the case. That is no longer the case. Now we are finding that actually high technology is not coming from Europe, not coming from the United States. High technology is coming from now Asia, including Korea and Japan, and of course even in China. And let me give you an example, like the camera. When you take a picture, if you look at the left-hand side, you can focus on the near side or the back side, right? See? So if you focus on the front side, the back side is blurred, right? Or you can do the opposite. You go to the right, and then if you want to focus on the little cat in the back, then the front side, the near side is blurred, right? See? And now they've working on a technology so that it's kind of like an MRI in a hospital, see? So they're developing a camera so that when you take a picture, the camera will take pictures simultaneously, like, several thousand pictures simultaneously, and then they put it together. And then when you see a picture, you can see a very clear picture on the front side as well as the back side, see? And that's kind of the new technology. The other one is, of course, 3D. We all know Samsung is at the vanguard, at the forefront of 3D. And the question, I guess, is that when you talk about 3D, can you see your pictures, the movies and TVs and the computer screens without glasses? Glasses, that's a lot of a hassle. So no one really wants to watch, television at home for 6 hours if you're wearing glasses. So really the key is, do we have the technology to see TV in 3D? And then let me tell you that that is coming. As a matter of fact, you don't even need a special TV for that. And so that, let me see if I can get this going. And let's see. Here's a Japanese beer commercial. And then actually here you cannot see the 3D effect very well, but on my computer I can see very clearly it's a 3D. It's a Japanese beer commercial. You can see 3D slightly. Well, let me make it clear that I'm not being paid by the Sapporo Beer Company. I wish I were, but again, my point is that when you talk about high technology, today it is not coming from America, it is not coming from Europe, it's coming from actually from Asia. And then so I'm sure there will be many more. Moving on, I was in China, as a matter of fact, last week, and then I came back last Sunday. And China, they do have some obviously problems, but before we talk about the Chinese problems, let's see what the China is. Again, I don't have to tell you that in terms of GDP, China is now the second largest economy in the world, and Japan, as you can see, has not been growing very much at all for quite some time, and China has been growing at an exponential rate, so now China is the second largest economy in the world. If you look at the foreign exchange reserves, again, I know you all know that, we are talking about something approaching $3.3 trillion, and that's a lot of money. If you look at the U.S. Treasury securities, China now owns 8% of all the U.S. Treasury securities outstanding, and then they own 25% of all the foreign-owned U.S. Treasuries. And China also is a big consumer, and so that's why, as I said earlier, if you want to buy and sell and invest, go to Asia. You look at the China's cars. On the right-hand side, you see these dots. There is a number of cars per 1,000 adults in 2010. In the United States, 961. In Japan, 532. In China, only 41. So there's a lot of room. It's a big market for China, and so that's why everyone is going to China. Also, we find that if you look at the pattern, the Chinese, they tend to buy cars and houses, condos, together. And so far, it's been going up at an exponential rate. Clearly, this is not going to continue with the economic slowdowns, but they are selling cars and they are selling houses. Inflation was a problem for a while, but that seems to be now under control. Food is very important. In some parts of China, as much as 80% of their CPI basket is in food. And of course, in cities like Beijing, it is much less. But the point is that when you look at the CPI in overall China, it is beginning to slow down, decelerating, and inflation there seems to be under control. Also, the loans. In 2008 and 2009, the government really poured a lot of money, encouraged the banks to lend money. And if you look at the total yuan loans the loans to real estate has been a very, very significant portion. Real estate is important in any country, including Korea. But in China, real estate is even more important. And then so if the real estate slows down or the bubble bursts, there will be a real problem. And then so, as you know, up until recently, the government of China, they put a stop to try to slow down bank lending to real estate and bank lending in general, which meant that if you look at the black portion of the bar, that is the so-called the shadow banking system. The shadow banking system is anything from private equity to loan sharks. And then so banks weren't lending because of government pressure. So, many developers and then many businesses, they had to go to the shadow banking system, including loan sharks. But now the Chinese government has reversed that, and now the banks are beginning to lend money again. The question is, will they be able to control the bubble? Now, government officials that I've talked to in China last week, they all say that they've got it under control because they are restricting purchases, and then they've increased actually property taxes, and then of course they raised until recently the interest rates. So they are saying that they've got the property bubble under control. Now prices are actually beginning to fall. You look at the left-hand side, you can see monthly change in Chinese property prices per square, and in 100 city average, property prices are actually declining. The question is, will it be a soft landing or will it be a hard landing? And then so many people are concerned that between the European economic slowdown, which is the largest market for China, and the property bubble bursting in, within China, that is going to slow the Chinese economy significantly, and that will have a significant impact on the, of course, the rest of the world. So again, as I pointed out, in China, the concerns are, well, China has to export. So if the U.S., Europe, and Japan are not doing very well, will China be able to grow? Probably not. And again, we just talked about the real estate bubble. And that's why the government of China has shifted their attention from now inflation to growth. Now they realize that the inflation is no longer a problem. Actually, they've done a good job of controlling inflation, so they are trying to now focus more on growth. My expectation is that they will lower interest rates again and again and again, and then also they'll be cutting taxes, and then government will spend more money. In China, there are a couple of good things about Chinese economy. Number one is the government of China has a lot of money, number one. Number two, the Chinese government, if they want to, they can control everything, including the price of real estate, so that if they want a soft landing, they'll get a soft landing, and then I assume that's going to be the case. When you look at economic growth, in 2012, the economic growth in China will probably fall below 8%. And, that is a serious issue because population in China, especially younger people, they are entering the labor force pretty rapidly. So you need to really grow the economy 8% or 9% to accommodate the young people coming into the labor force. But in 2012, that is not going to be the case. And that creates, of course, a social problem and political problems for the Communist Party. And but in the long run, it's pretty clear that the Chinese economy will not be growing at the rate of 9% or 10% or 11% they did. In some years as high as 14% or higher. But I think in 2012 and then beyond, my hope is that they will have a soft landing, but will be growing around 8%. And then so this will probably keep the jobless rate about the same. What I'm saying is that when you look at the Chinese economic outlook, in the short run, the economy will grow at a slower rate. And again, that will have a significant impact on many countries, including Korea. As you know, over 20% of Korean exports go to China. And that is the largest export market for Korea. And so Korea will be adversely affected by that. If you look at the medium term, still I believe the Chinese economy will grow at a healthy pace. And when you look at the global economy, I think it's fair to say that many people are lost, confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, and then bewildered. And then so that includes me, even though I'm an economist. And then so we will have to wait and see where we are going. But again, if you look at the Korea's economic growth, my hope and expectation is that Korea's economy will grow probably more like a 3.5%. I guess the message that I'm trying to tell you today, this morning, is that the global economic problems are much more serious than a lot of people realize, and it is not going to be solved anytime soon. A couple of years ago, I actually wrote a book. It was written in Korean. It was published right here, and in the process of writing the book, I spent a lot of time studying world economic history, the American, the European, and then even Japanese economic growth patterns. One important lesson I've learned through my research was this: there can be many reasons why you have economic bust, economic slowdowns, economic recessions. But the reasons are very important. If you have economic slowdown, economic bust, as a result of a financial crisis, history tells us that that goes on for a long, long time. It takes a long time to fix. And that's the situation that we are in. We are in a current situation, predicament, because of the financial crisis. And this is not going to go away anytime soon. It will take not months, but it will take probably years. And that's one of the reasons why, we're not talking about meaningful economic growth anywhere around the world, especially amongst advanced nations, anytime soon. Again, I consider Korea to be economically an advanced nation, so I put Korea in that category. And again, Korea will be experiencing a fairly serious economic slowdown. I know the Bank of Korea and the government of Korea have lowered economic growth rates, but my concern is that might even be too optimistic, not because what is happening in Korea. If you look at the global economy as the ocean, an economy, whether it's a Japanese economy or Korean economy, is like a ship in an ocean, a vast open ocean. And so when the open ocean is moving up and down, that is going to affect the ship, like the ship of Korea, like the ship of Japan, and ship of China. And then so that is really the situation that we face. What I'm saying is that when you look at the Korean economy, if we do see a surprise, as a matter of fact, we all know that all economic forecasts are wrong except mine, right? And then, but if we are wrong in 2012, we are going to be too optimistic. That will especially be true in case of Korea, because Korea is so export dependent. And then, of course, the Korean households have a lot of debt. Today, I wish I had the time to go through my research based on the Korean debt, the household debt. But the Korean household debt is much higher than household debt of the United States. A lot of people think that the American consumers have spent too much, they've incurred too much debt, and that is true. When you look at the Korean consumers, they are even worse off than that, see? And so again, I've got the data to prove that. So I think in 2012, the surprise will be on the downside, not on the upside. Let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about investment implications, and then again, I'll be happy to talk about the investment implications in Korean or in English, as you wish. But if you look at the global economic picture, you can really, again, divide it into two categories. Advanced nations, they're not going to grow very much. Emerging market nations, including China, their economies will slow, but relatively they will be doing better. I'm not telling you anything you do not know. But then, you as an investor, where do you invest? I think still the flight to quality, flight to safe haven, that has been and I think will continue to be very, very important. See? And then so people are today more concerned about keeping your investments intact rather than earning higher yields. And that means money will continue to flow to the United States. Money will continue to flow to Japan and Switzerland and etc. And then so, even though United States have a lot of debt, I know countries like China have been concerned about the value of the dollar. The fact of the matter is that still the United States is the safest place to be in. It's a large economy, and then again, U.S. government has a U.S. dollar printing press. And despite all the talks, I still say that United States is one of the places that you want to keep your money in because it is a very, very safe haven. Now, beyond that, you can go to other nations such as China, maybe in Korea, and India and Indonesia. There are a couple of problems there. Again, even those economies are going to slow down because many of these emerging market economies are heavily dependent upon exports to advanced nations, and then so that's one of the problems. The other problem is that when money moves to safe havens from Korea to from India, for example, the Indian rupee is depreciating rapidly. The Chinese renminbi is depreciating. And where is the money going? Money is going to Switzerland. Money is going to Japan. Money is going to the United States. And so when you look at the value of the dollar has and will continue to appreciate not because the U.S. economy is doing so well, but because of a safe haven. And so if you invest in a country like China or even India, there will be economic slowdown. That's one of the concerns. And the other concern is, of course, at the end of the day, you want to get your money back in your own currency, and those currencies will probably depreciate. Again, my conclusion is that in the next 2 years or so, next year or so anyway, it is really not the time to take a whole lot of risk. Keeping your money safe and stable, to me, that should be the first priority. And again, that has implications for the value of the dollar. Again, you are counting your investments at the end of the day in your own currency, whether it's a Korean won or the dollar. I think the currency valuation, that is important as well. And again, I'm saying that the safe haven countries will see their currency appreciation. And many of the emerging market nations from China and India, they will see their currencies depreciating, and then you should take that into consideration. If you look at the United States, of course, I am more familiar with investments in the United States. Clearly the areas like junk bonds, that is one area to avoid. When the economy is not doing very well, the junk bonds don't do very well at all, and that is the current situation right now. On the other hand, if you look at high quality corporations, it could be IBM, it could be General Electric, and if you look at some of the high corporate bonds, they offer very attractive yields. As a matter of fact, you can get 5%, 6%, 7% on some AAA companies, and then so that's one of the areas that I'm recommending that people look into. And then so if you look at the safe haven countries, and if you come to the United States for safe haven, the question is where do you put it in? I guess one area, is treasuries, because it is safe but doesn't give you any interest rate. The second area that you can get into is, I think, high quality corporate bonds. And the third area that I'm recommending people get into is, of course, high dividend paying stocks. Again, I can give you a list of high-quality companies in the United States. Some drug companies, some railroads and transportation companies. They are paying dividends of 5 to 6% a year, and clearly that is not guaranteed. But in this environment, when you can invest in high-quality stocks and earn 5 to 6% in dividends, that's not bad at all. And then so I'm saying that, these are the areas that you should look into. Let me stop here, and then, I've talked quite a lot, and let me stop here, and then at this point, I'll be very happy to answer any questions or comments, again, either in Korean or in English.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. It was not only informative, but also very entertaining, especially Sapporo beer. Advertisement, and I think Dr. Sun covered very interesting subjects here. He covered all those current state of the world situation, and particularly reviewed in the last few minutes for investment implications. That sounds like very interesting. So I expect some questions or comments from the floor, and if you do, please raise your hand and identify yourself and ask your questions less than 1 or 2 minutes at most. If there are any questions from the floor, raise your hand.
Dr. Sun, thank you for your excellent and useful and pertinent presentation. My name is Lee Sang-sol. As you know, Lee is my family name. Allow me to ask you layman's practical question in English. Where, in which area of industry we should make investments while undergoing economic crisis situation, in your view, briefly speaking? My last question is Sapporo beer any better than Obi or Qingdao beer, taste-wise and price-wise, in your view?
I'll answer the second question first. No, I don't think Sapporo beer is any better. As a matter of fact, I love a Korean beer, and so I'll drink a Korean beer anytime. But obviously, Sapporo, I think, in terms of commercials, they are beating the Korean beer. So maybe the Korean beer company should come up with some ingenious, innovative 3D commercial like they have. And then so, I go around the world and give a lot of these speeches, and I've been showing this commercial each time. And actually, I should, call them, and they should pay me, right? Because, so anyway. More seriously about the first question, when you talk about investment implications, again, starting from the big picture, I'm saying that given the global economic situation, which is going to probably be unsettling, it could get actually worse. And then, believe me, the European situation has not been solved. It's probably get worse. And then so until we solve the problems, again, I talked about the banks taking haircuts, and I talked about the breaking up the euro. It's going to be painful. It's going to take a long time. It's not going to happen overnight, next 6 months. And then so in this economic environment, safety, safe haven, that's really the key. And then money will move into those countries considered to be safe haven. So that's why, again, I'm recommending investing in the United States or maybe some emerging market nations selectively for diversification purposes. But if you come to the U.S., I'm recommending the treasuries, and then some of the high-quality bonds, and then high dividend-paying stocks. To answer the question, what industries would I recommend? Well, clearly, I think technology is very important, because in this environment, the market share is really the key. When the economy is growing, everybody can have more, right? When the market is not growing globally and anywhere, then really the way to grow is by getting market share. How do you grow market share? One of the ways you can do that is applying technology. And by applying technology, hopefully you can cut costs, raise productivity, and then come up with a more innovative products. And then so I think that's really the way to go. So I think technology in general. Again, I'm not expert enough to tell you that which technology, but that's one of the areas that I'm very high on. The other thing that we are finding is that really the auto industry. In this current environment, you would think that a lot of people should not be buying cars, right? But in the United States, for example, and then to some extent in Europe, cars are selling very well. I also talked about China, the potential demand for China. In the United States, as I pointed out from the chart, per thousand population, there are about 680 cars, and in China it's less than 1/10 of that. So there's a tremendous growth potential in China. So in emerging markets. So I don't have a list, but there are others. But I would really recommend those two areas: technology related, and then the auto related, primarily because of pent up demand in Asia, in the United States, and also pent up demand in countries like China, for example.
What is your view on the course of movements about the currencies, including the U.S., Japanese yen, and Chinese yuan, and euro? What will happen, do you think, to these relative prices of these foreign exchanges?
In the short run, no one knows. If I knew, I wouldn't be telling you. But as an economist, I can try to guess what the longer-term trend is. When I say longer-term, I'm talking about 6 months to a year, really. Beyond that, who knows what could happen. In general, going back to, let me just talk about we all know as economists what determines the value of the currency. The key is, of course, economic growth. The stronger the economic growth, therefore, the stronger the currency. And the other one is, of course, inflation. Higher the inflation, lower the value of the currency. And in the current situation, this is what I call reverse beauty contest as far as economies are concerned. It's not a question of who's most beautiful, but who's least ugly. And in this case, again, the safe haven countries, Japan, Switzerland, and the United States, these are the least ugly countries in terms of the currency values because of the safe haven. Whereas if you look at the, India, for example, their currency has been depreciating rapidly. Why? Because they've got double-digit inflation rates, and the government is having problem, with the regulations, and so economy is kind of sputtering, and then so. If you invested in India, for example, 6 months ago, your investment today would be worth much less. And so India is not a safe haven nation, and inflation is high, and economic growth is slowing down rapidly. And then so also in China, as you know, now the Chinese economy is actually slowing down. And the central bank and the government of China is actually intervening in the marketplace to prevent the Chinese currency from depreciating too much. They're trying to keep it within the band that we all know about. And then so, this is what's happening. So again, my expectation is that the key is what are the safe haven countries, and how will they do? And so when you look at countries like Europe, for example, the euro, I expect the euro to continue to depreciate. And I never really understood why the euro became as expensive as it was a while ago, and now it is much less expensive. But still, I think it's pretty expensive. We will see a lot more money coming out of Europe and then going elsewhere. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why they have a credit crunch in Europe, because no one wants to leave their money in Europe. See, and so the central bank of United States, the Federal Reserve, they have engaged in the swaps, as you know, to provide the dollar currency to Europe. And then so again, I think that really the key is the safe haven currency, and then all the other nations, including Korea and China, and etc. In the next 6 months to a year, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see currency depreciation. And again, in investment implications, in fact, when you invest, the studies have shown that when you invest in a foreign country, the vast majority of your gains or losses is related to really currency fluctuation, not so much the performance of the industry. So that's why the currency issue is such an important issue.
편의상 한국말로 설명하겠습니다.
네.
나는 삼성 KPMG에 공무원으로 있는데 제가 공직생활의 재무부 관세청을 통해서 미국의 도움을 많이 받아서 우리가 지금 사회가 여러 가지로 향상되는데 지금 아까 말씀하신 대로 아시아가 세계 GDP에 기여하는 것이 크기 때문에 반드시 이 아시아의 금융허브로서 상해나 일본이나 서울 중심이 하나 있어야만 미국의 금융시장도 발달되기 때문에 이번 FTA는 이게 한미 군사동맹을 초월해서 경제동맹이라고 해요. 그래서 나는 미국이 한국을 아시아의 금융허브를 하나 만드는 걸 같이 움직여서 세계 금융의 역할을 하는데 좋은 기회가 왔다고 생각하는데 우리 금융인 동시에 지금 한국계로서 날리신 분이 한번 이걸 대한민국의 금융허브를 만드는데 기여하시면 어떨까. 그동안에 이명박 정부가 초기에 우리나라 금융가들이 만든다고 했는데 하다 되지도 않았는데 지금부터 금융기관을 개혁을 하면서 하면 한국의 금융허브로서 정말 잘 사는 나라가 될 수 있다고 보는데 거기에 대해서 제가 엉뚱한 질문인지 모르지만 우리 손 박사님의 지혜를 좀 구하고 싶습니다.
You know, I'm a Korean, and then I would love to see Seoul becoming a financial hub. But there are a number of problems. Number one, of course, is English. I know younger people, they are studying English from grade school, so 10, 20, 30 years from now would be a different story. But when you look at my contemporaries, English is one of the problems. And then so, if you went to the Philippines, if you went to Europe, and if you go to some other countries, it's much easier to speak English. And then so English is really the financial language, so that's one of the key problems. The other one is the Korea does not have what I call the Wimbledon effect. Let me explain what I mean by the Wimbledon effect. In England, there's a tennis match called the Wimbledon tennis match, right? Okay. If you look at the Wimbledon tennis match, the British people, the English people, they never won anything. I can't remember the last time a British won a Wimbledon match, okay? But the important thing is not so much that a British person wins a Wimbledon match, but the important thing is that that's where the tennis match takes place, see? Now, London is a financial hub. New York is a financial hub. Not because that's where the money is. That money is fungible, it can go anywhere, see, right? Electronically. But, they come to New York, they come to London. Why? Because you go to London, for example, about a third of the people in the London financial district is from overseas, from United States, from China, from India, all over, okay? Now, so culturally, you have to be accepting people from other countries. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Still, the Korean economy, the Korean culture is too insulated. You do not accept, people from overseas very well. Even though, I speak Korean, I was born in this country, I was educated in this country. But, when I come here from overseas, they still say, well, you didn't go to college and you don't know the right people. My brother says, you should never come to Korea and get a job because, here you didn't go to college, and then if you didn't go to college, you're not going to see. The reason is, sure, the lineup is very important in Korea, see? Okay? So you have a president, you have a, chairman of a bank. I mean, the lineup is very important. So you have to get into the right line. And so my brother tells me that, I have no line because I didn't go to college. So that the probability of my success in Korea is zero, he says. So don't ever come to Korea, he says. So the point I'm making is that we don't have the Wimbledon effect, see, in Korea. So, I, as a Korean, I like to, see it as much as, any place else. I was just in Shanghai last week, and Shanghai, unfortunately for us Koreans, has a much better chance of becoming a financial hub. The surprisingly, the Chinese, they are much more open. See, they are more flexible. They are more accepting of foreign people, like myself. Not in Korea. See, and I can actually give you examples where. Some foreigners were hired and then, went into government offices. I'm not going to, tell which agency, but to make long story short, what happened was that this person came and he was specifically hired, and he was no one to talk to him. See, and then so he would, get his work done during the day in his cubicle, and he goes home and no friends, and he was lonely. He went back. See, and so that's how our culture is. That needs to change. it's not going to change overnight, over time. And then so I think we need to change that, and to do that, I think we need strong leadership. Until then, unless we do that, we cannot be a financial hub.
Thank you very much for your active participation and frank exchange of views this morning. And for announcement, we'll have next year, January 19th, we have already invited Dr. Alan Sinai to provide you an outlook, global outlook again. And so that Alan Sinai is a very computation man, and he brings with all the actual estimates of the numbers. So I think it's a good combination. Today's talk and the next, today's is very qualitative one and very informative one. So next one is very numerical one. So we'll make a good combination. So I hope we'll meet again next month, January 19th. Thank you very much for participating.